So why is socialism called the gospel of envy? A few years ago, Daniel did a series on postmodernism. He talked about nihilism, all these isms. And the key with every single ism is there is a root sin that goes with it. And if you understand that root sin, you can begin the process of untangling the knot that causes it to have life. But in every generation, they tend to repeat, they tend to recycle. And every generation has to learn those lessons all over again. And so because we're in a generation now where we're beginning to see socialists elected to public office, I thought we need to really think hard about this. And so Churchill said that socialism was a philosophy of failure, a creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. And so what we want to do today is talk about how socialism has failed. We want to talk about why it's a creed of ignorance, why ignorance is reflected in socialism, ignorance of human nature, ignorance of history. Why is the gospel of envy? Why envy is that root sin that permeates socialism. If you remember, we talked about critical theory, critical race theory a few years ago. Critical theory came out of the Frankfurt School. It's one of those Marxist-based theories. And within critical theory, there's this concept of redefining words. So not technically redefining words. Critical theorists will use the word democracy, but what they mean when they say that is different. And they pick these words on purpose. They're a common lexicon for us, but for them, they have alternative meanings. So we always want to start with a definition. And so socialism, according to Merriam-Webster, is any economic or political theory that advocates governmental ownership of the means of production and distribution. It's also a system of society or group living in which there is no private property. So the complete disestablishment of private property. And then it's a transitional stage of society. So in Marxist theory, socialism is stage one. And it's on a continuum. So that continuum, it moves from capitalism to democratic socialism and then to communism. It's never seen as an end goal. If you're curious about the difference between communism and socialism, so socialism acknowledges that there's still private property and there's still inequity in society. Communism has eliminated that entirely. There is no inequity because everyone has the same things. There is no private property. And so, like I said, just a line on a continuum heading towards socialism. The World Socialist Party of the U.S. indicated that the terms communism and socialism to them are synonymous. So you can't let people get you tripped up in an argument and say, well, we're just democratic socialists, we're not communists. And as we said, the definitions in critical theory, definitions being used by socialists, are not what we're thinking of. So democracy is a great example. So the word democracy to us is item number one. Democracy is a form of government that allows for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, free elections. But in their mind, democracy is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for equality. We're in a democratic society. That means we have equality across the board. Everyone has the same things. Everyone has the same outcomes. They have the same property, gender, transgenderism, climate, marriage. All those things are normalized. So that to them is democracy. So you may be saying the same words, but you have different meanings. So when someone says they're a democratic socialist, it simply means that they're using the tools of democracy to gain power and then to implement that socialist agenda. So most socialists will tell you that they want number one, but they're striving for number two. Let's talk for just a minute about historical socialism. Because it's one of those ideologies that have a root sin, it will continue, like I said, to repeat in every era. So it would take us, an entire semester to go through every instance of socialism in society. But going back, remember we talked about Paul in Athens. So Plato was a philosopher in Athens. And Plato's perspective was that he believed there should be no private property, state ownership of everything. The children should be raised by the government, right? So that initial kind of vision of socialism, even though it wasn't called that, you can find it in Plato's Republic. And so this is one of the things that Marx read. When we talked about the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of man, Marx was a huge fan of Greek philosophers and philosophy. And then fast forward a little bit, another major experiment with socialism was the French Revolution. So it was an egalitarian movement. Everyone had to be equal. You had to own the same things. It turned bloody when the Jacobins, which were that political party there in Paris, decided they wanted everyone to be really equal. So anyone with a college degree, doctors, lawyers, wealth, anything that sets you apart, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. So anything that sets you apart costs you your head. And eventually, Robespierre, the man who started the French Revolution, lost his own head. And so these movements tend to eat themselves. And then we had American experiments with socialism. And a lot of folks aren't familiar with these. But the Puritans, when they first came over, the Mayflower Compact was actually an agreement where the people who funded the expedition demanded that the Puritans live according to socialist principles. So they had to have everything in common. Everyone had to have the same food. Everyone had to have the same clothing. Whatever was produced had to be shared equally. And after a year, the governor, William Bradford, said, "We're done with this. This is insane. Some people are working, some people aren't working. There's starvation." So we basically gave everyone a plot of land and a pile of seeds and said, "Your survival is on you." So that was the first American experiment. But there were also what they call the utopian socialism experiments. And these are not well known either. And they were all very small towns or villages in the U.S. And we'll talk in the next chart about those. And then there were some advances in the 20s and 30s with socialism and anarchism, especially because anarchism was big in Europe at the time. But after the Russian Revolution in 1917, everyone looked at that authoritarian regime and said, yeah, socialism, probably not for us. So it began to die in popularity, and then McCarthyism killed it. So remember, they were arresting anyone that they thought was a Soviet agent, communist, socialist. They were all scooped up. So at that point, socialism in the U.S. basically died. But we want to go back a little bit in time. We want to pause right here when we're talking about utopian socialism, because there's a nexus here with Karl Marx. And I think it's very important to understand how this played out. And so I think in my email, I might have said Iowa. New Harmony was in Indiana. So my mistake. But there were several of these. I only listed a few here. New Harmony, Indiana, Brook Farm, Massachusetts, and Utopia, Ohio. So these were American experiments with socialist organizations and socialist towns. And they all had generally the same principles, everything shared in common. And we want to look at New Harmony specifically because that's where our nexus is with communism. The man who founded it was Robert Owen, and he was a British industrialist. He was a socialist. He found out later he was a spiritualist, so he would do seances. He went to Congress and he tried to pitch this idea of socialist experiments. And I don't know how that meeting turned out, but obviously he received permission to do it. And so he goes to New Harmony. He sets this place up. And his goal was a society with no religion. Of course, religion is the opiate of the masses, so no religion. He wanted no private property and no marriage, so it was polygamous. And it's in this little town in Indiana where the term socialism was actually coined. So it's an American term. But by 1829, the same thing that happened to the Puritans happened in New Harmony. People weren't working, right? So people would work really hard and produce a lot, and then they would see all that given to people that weren't working, and that just created this division and strife, and eventually violence and New Harmony. And so it was dissolved by about 1829. And Owen returned to England. Of course, he hadn't learned his lesson, so he's still pitching socialism in England. And he went to the Manchester Hall of Science. So he was from Manchester. He goes back to Manchester. He builds these halls. And the halls of science were secular churches. They would meet on Sundays. They had their own priests, their own bishops. They had their own hymn books. And they would sing, I've got a copy at home of one of the hymns to socialism. So he would be there giving presentations on Sundays. And there was a young man sitting in the audience. So Frederick Engels was in Manchester. He was attending these halls of science. He was listening to everything Owen was saying, all the lessons he learned in New Harmony. And Engels is writing this down in his notebook. And eventually, Engels becomes best friends with Karl Marx. So Engels' father had sent him out of Germany on purpose to get him away from Karl Marx and men like Karl Marx. And he passed along everything to Marx that he had learned. And so I thought you would enjoy this. Charles Spurgeon, who we quote constantly in this class, called the Prince of Preachers, lived in the same town at the same time as Karl Marx, the apostle of evil. I'm sure this conversation never happened, but it probably should have. Spurgeon at that time was preaching to an audience of 10,000 people. Metropolitan Tabernacle had 10,000 people there hearing the gospel. And on the other side of town, you've got Karl Marx avoiding work. He doesn't have a job. He's relying on handouts. And he's actively working to destroy every institution God has created. He didn't have a home, so he's in the British Library working on the Communist Manifesto. So these two men in the same spot, the same city, and they're seeing the same conditions, right? The Industrial Revolution is in London at the time, and the working conditions are terrible. The workers are starving. There's child labor. There are many reasons why people would be discontented. And, Spurgeon is preaching the gospel as the solution to those issues, and Marx is preaching his gospel. Marx was in London because he'd been actually expelled from his home country of Germany, expelled from France, and expelled from Belgium. So he was a stateless man. He died in London at the age of 64. But his ideas did not die. Here's a quote from Spurgeon on the very bottom. He was definitely paying attention to what was happening in London. And he said, German rationalism, which has ripened into socialism, may yet pollute the mass of mankind and lead them to overturn the foundations of society. So very prescient comment, and that's exactly what it did. So the natural consequence of Marx's ideas played out in short order. The Communist Manifesto was published in London. And after that, Marx's critique of capitalism, Das Kapital, was also published in London. And as Marx is writing these books, he's thinking about all the influences. He's thinking about Owen in Indiana. And he's thinking about Kant and Hegel, the philosophers, German philosophers, and on Greek philosophers. He loved Aristotle. And he wrote his dissertation for his PhD on Epicurus. So remember, we talked about the Athenian philosophers, and Epicurus was the man who started the Epicurean philosophy movement. And back to this discussion on the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of man. So Marx was immersed in the wisdom of man. The first revolution to use his playbook, the Communist Manifesto, was 1917. So that was the October Revolution in Russia. The Russian army was actually gone. It was engaged in World War I. And Vladimir Lenin took advantage of the fact that there was no army to put down a revolt. And he went in and seized power with the Bolsheviks. And immediately after seizing power, the Red Terror begins. So this is the execution of all the Tsar's officials. Remember, the Tsar himself was killed in the revolution, and his wife was killed, and all of his daughters were killed. But then they went about the business of killing every Tsarist official. And labor camps were set up, and we'll talk a little bit about the gulags in a few charts, and police state tactics. So throughout the 20th century, revolutions based on these ideas wreaked havoc. And there was a serious death toll associated with them. So near the White House, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation has set up a museum. And if you go there, if you're visiting D.C., it's an interesting place. It's like the Holocaust Museum. Not all that bright and lively and encouraging, but it tells a true story, a story that we don't hear very often. More than 100 million people died in the 20th century because of socialism and communism. And I've just got a few of the causes here: executions, forced labor, political purges, intentional famines. They don't cost a penny. You don't have to spend money on bullets, no machine guns, none of that. Just simply starve a people to death. It's free. And it was done often. In Soviet Russia, 25 million of Stalin's own people died. And it was purges. Anyone who made a disparaging comment about communism, the gulags were set up. Gulags were prison camps all across the Soviet Union. The Holodomor in Ukraine, which hardly anyone knows about. So 3 to 5 million people starved to death in Ukraine. So the kulaks, the indigenous people in that area, did not want collectivism. They didn't want Soviet communism. And that was the breadbasket at the time of the Soviet Union. So they made them produce the wheat, but then they shipped out every bit of it and left them with nothing. There are people that actually died outside the doors of wheat granaries, waiting for food, for a scrap. And it was the death penalty actually to even pick up wheat on the ground to try to survive on it. Forced deportations. And Maoist China, 40 to 60 million dead. So the Great Leap Forward famine killed upwards of 45 million people. And that wasn't necessarily an intentional famine. It was a famine based on corruption, mismanagement, taking over the means of production when it comes to agriculture and giving it to people that don't know how to do agriculture was a horrible idea. And they had that centralized agriculture where you, again, like Ukraine, where you grow the food, but then you have to ship it all out to different cities. And then they had something called the Four Pests Initiative. So the Four Pests Initiative in China was to eliminate all the pests that could harm agriculture. And they had a bunch of insects listed there, but the fourth one on the list was sparrows. So they called it the Sparrow Program, and they killed every sparrow they could get their hands on because they saw that they were pests and they were harming agriculture. Well, in fact, that ecosystem required the sparrows to help keep the pests down. So when they did that, it made the famine even worse. The killing fields in Cambodia, if you saw that movie, the Khmer Rouge killed 2 million people. So that was an intentional genocide of intellectuals and political opponents. 1 in 4 people died. And then, of course, North Korea is still going on. Purges, disappearances, all that. So this is the true cost of fully implementing socialism and then communism in a country. Now, we've talked about Solzhenitsyn before. If you've read the Gulag Archipelago in high school, if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. He was a loyal Soviet officer in the military in World War II. And he was overheard making a disparaging comment about Stalin. And of course, convicted without a trial and thrown into a gulag in Siberia for 8 years. So for 8 years, he went through this torture. He took little notes, little scraps of paper, wherever he could find them, he hid them away. And eventually, when he was released, those scraps of paper turned into the Gulag Archipelago, the book. But he shares some of his horrible experiences in it. And he was asked to give a commencement at Harvard in 1978. And he just had a few quotes here. We couldn't give you the entire speech. But he said, "Many people living in the West are dissatisfied with their own society. A number of such critics turn to socialism, which is a false and dangerous current. And then having experienced applied socialism in a country where the alternative has been realized, I certainly will not speak for it. And then finally, socialism of any type and shade leads to a total destruction of the human spirit and a leveling of mankind into death. So from the man who saw that play out firsthand, saw the suffering, saw the death. But despite all those things, experiments with socialism continued throughout the 20th century. And Venezuela is the lowest hanging fruit. It's the best example we can use on the consequences because we watched it play out in real time. And so in 1950, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world. Their GDP was the fourth highest per person. They had more cars per person than New York City. Democratically elected Hugo Chavez came in and decided he was going to implement socialism at scale in Venezuela. When that happened, you got failed production, you had corruption, mismanagement, just like you saw in the Soviet Union, just like you saw in Maoist China. And food production dropped 75% in 2 decades. So you had starvation going on. At the same time, he's implementing these socialist programs. He's jacking up paychecks. He's hiring people to do no job. He is expanding welfare and guaranteed income and all those things, setting up price controls. And so all those things really ever did was guarantee the failure of the country. They had countrywide blackouts. They had food and water shortages. And eventually 60% of all private companies in Venezuela left. Their currency lost 99% of its value. But as of 2015, they were the largest refugee group in the world. 7.1 million Venezuelans scattered around the world, fleeing from this socialist government. We've had some recent developments. I haven't really looked at, how they are right now, but I understand that Nicolas Maduro is gone, so maybe they're making progress. So with all these examples, again, you would think that we would never even tolerate a discussion on this topic, but we are. And so socialism is on the rise again in the U.S., largely because we've forgotten the lessons of the past. 57% of registered Democrats view socialism favorably. It's now very popular, very trendy with young, highly paid professionals, and that's mostly white college-aged women, 18 to 29. I saw a stat that says since 2010, nearly 50% of U.S. adults, the young adults, have viewed socialism favorably. Its popularity is growing, and it's largely disaffected younger people. They graduate college. They have this promise of prosperity. When they get their degree, they can't get the job they think they deserve. And they're listening to the promises of socialism. And what you do see a lot of is this discussion on the Nordic model. So the Scandinavian countries, they're all socialist and they're all great. Everyone's happy. Well, the problem is they're not socialist countries. They have free market economies. They have strong property rights. They have trade freedom. They have monetary freedom. It's the capitalism in these countries that actually pays for the larger safety net that their society has, free health care. Well, someone pays for the free health care. It's the capitalists, that are paying for it. So the Nordic model is not a socialist model. And I did want you to see this organization seems to be the nexus around this reemergence of socialism in America. They claim 80,000 members. There are 200 college chapters. Columbia does have a chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. The newly elected mayor of New York, Zoran Mamdani, is a DSA member, and so is the mayor of Seattle. And if you looked at blue states, but also red states, if you looked at some of the city councils, what you would see is some of the city councils are actually being taken over by DSA members. And there are two factions in this group. So the Groundwork Caucus is that faction that believes in democratic socialism. You gain power through democratic means. The other group opposes even electoral politics. That's the Red Star Caucus. They just want the communist revolution. 13 of the 16 committee members that run DSA are acknowledged communists. And then their platform, just like every other socialist organization, redistribution of wealth, eliminating private property, eliminating prisons, police, free healthcare, free everything. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, all of them called themselves social democrats. They were all part of a social democratic movement before they became communist. So he has a great smile. Behind that smile, though, I think there's some ideas that are going to be very destructive for New York. He was elected in November 2025, and I wanted to capture the demographic that put him in power, just so you could see this. 84% of young women, 18 to 29-year-old, voted for him. 62% of the non-native vote. So Muslims, Hindus, atheists. 85% of the voters who had lived in New York for less than 5 years. And then 82% identified as LGBTQ. So you have a demographic of people that are either new to New York from other places, or, like I said, disaffected young women that have put him in power. In his inaugural address, he talked about replacing rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism. And then one of the first things that he did was appoint C. Weaver, and C is a DSA member. She was a housing activist, and he put her in charge of the Office to Protect Tenants in New York. And she has called in the past for the election of more communists to public office. And she's also called for the seizure of private property, especially the property of white people, because, it's a tool of white supremacy if you own property. And her comment was, white people in New York are going to have a different relationship to property. So this is the implementation of socialism at scale, beginning in our biggest city. And it is a gospel of envy. It reappears, like we said, in every generation because there's a sin at the root of it. And that sin goes all the way back to Cain and Abel. Envy is that sin. It never leaves the human heart. Proverbs 14:30 says, a tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. So that is the rot inside this ideology. And progressives consistently choose socialism and liberals because it formalizes that envy, and then it legitimizes it, and then it implements it, right? Eat the rich. You've heard that comment. Of course, by seizing a means of production, by stealing what belongs to others and redistributing it, sees that it's creating justice or believes that it's creating justice. And one thing that it does, folks are often confused by, it sees all inequality in society as evil. So that completely ignores God's gifting, God's calling. That ignores individual responsibility. It ignores the consequences of sin. Proverbs talks throughout the entire book about the inequality of man, right? The man who is industrious versus the man who is lazy. And so inequality is not evil. And here's another quote from Spurgeon at the bottom there. They are going to regenerate the world by democratic socialism and set up a kingdom for Christ without the new birth. The latter-day gospel is not the gospel by which we were saved. So this is the gospel of envy. So when you're talking about these things with other folks, and sometimes they'll talk about Jerusalem and the Christians in Jerusalem that had everything in common. And they'll say, well, that's Christian communism. We should be communist or we should be socialist. And you really need to kind of look back at Acts 4. So first of all, Acts is a narrative book. So it's descriptive. Secondly, throughout the New Testament, you don't see this pattern repeated again. But in Jerusalem, just after Jesus was resurrected, just after Peter's Pentecost sermon, the entire church was together. It was a beautiful time. No one saw anything they owned as theirs. They saw it as belonging to everyone, and whenever there was a need, they sold their property, and they gave it to meet that need. And so when you compare that to communism, there's a couple errors there, logical errors. And the first is they didn't own the means of production. They weren't a part of the means of production. This was private property. And then early Christians, they didn't disavow owning property, Paul never said not to own property. They sold their property because they were generous, and they did it to care for brothers and sisters. And they retained control of their property even after they sold it. They retained control of the proceeds. And if you read the story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5:4, you'll see this speech that Peter is giving to Ananias. And he tells him, while it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? Of course it did. And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal? Why is it that you have contrived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to man, but to God. So Peter's telling Ananias, you could have kept your property. You could have sold it and given half. You could have sold it and given all. But he sold it, gave a part, and then lied to Peter and to the Holy Spirit. So it ended poorly for Ananias. And then their donations were always freely given. They were never mandated by the state. There was no redistribution of wealth. So this is a non sequitur. It's an argument that doesn't wash. They were not communist. But the Bible does talk a lot about compassion. We're told to have compassion for the poor. Someone brought up, the gleaning of fields. There's an Old Testament law that said if you own property, that you can't harvest it out to the borders. You have to leave a strip, and then the poor can come in and glean what's left over. So there was provision made for them. There's prohibitions against oppressing widows, orphans, sojourners, and meeting the material needs of people. So 1 John 3:17. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? So we're to meet the needs of those that do have needs. And Jesus was our exemplar for compassion. So we wept with those that wept. He fed the hungry. He healed the sick. But then none of those things were social engineering. None of those things were redistribution. And embracing socialism is not biblical compassion. And I'll say this, I didn't pull in any more data about the fraud cases that are ongoing in our country. But we've got Medicare fraud, child care fraud, food distribution fraud, COVID fraud. I mean, it's almost like every day there's a new category of fraud. And so this is not compassion. In fact, if the money that's going to people who are greedily stealing it takes money and food out of the mouths of people that actually need it, this is not compassion. So charity within the Bible is very much tied to the second greatest commandment. We're to love our brother as we love ourselves. And that includes helping to meet their material needs. But biblical charity requires discernment, and it requires wisdom. So in 1 Timothy 5, Paul is telling Timothy, include the widows that don't have family, not the widows that do. Include the older widows, not the younger widows. Why? Because the widows that had family, the family should take care of them. The older widows should be taken care of. The younger widows could be remarried. So Paul had a filter for charity that he passed everything through. And then he even talked in 2 Thessalonians 3:10 about the man who doesn't work shouldn't eat. So he had a work requirement for charity as well. And we don't talk about this enough, but our church has 35 local missions. And Harvest Hope, Oliver Gospel, just down the street, the homeless shelter. The co-op ministry is a food bank and a clothing bank. And then the diaconate has what's called the Deacons Fund. They expend money from that fund every single week. Every week, money is going out to help meet emergency needs, to help meet medical needs. And so they always look through those filters, though. That discernment, that wisdom that requires you to look and see, is this a genuine need? So that's called stewardship, and that's what we're called to do in the church. So just to summarize, socialism, it does identify some real societal issues, but it fails to understand the root causes, and it uses its own root of envy to implement solutions that are not biblical solutions for society. The 20th century, like we've seen just a little snapshot, it's a long litany of failed experiments with socialism. And it's resurging now in our country. I didn't talk about the church statistics, but over 40% of young people in the church have a favorable opinion of socialism. So it's not just in society at large. So within the church, we've got to do a better job of talking about this. I know us old folks think, well, you just should read a history book, but that's not how it works. Every generation learns this all over again. And biblical compassion and charity are critical for us, but that's not the same thing as redistribution of wealth. And the true answer, of course, is not a humanistic utopia. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's the influence of the church in society to help meet material needs, but more importantly, to help meet spiritual needs.